It's unavoidable this week to think about what happened 10 years ago. I love that we've got our We Are Orlando banner over there. Thanks again to Ross for making sure that that was available. We've suffered tragedy and salt on the wound. I can't help but think back to that crosswalk that the state decided to go in the dead of night to erase. But friends, we cannot be erased. Thinking about all of this intolerance and all of this hate, I think it's an important place to start, even here in Pride Month, because there are so many things that have been used to harm people. There's so many ways in which the Word of God has been used as a weapon of hate and destruction. And it's interesting because the closer we look, we'll find that there's more to the story, that there's more going on. And today I want to take just a little bit of time to look at one of those stories that seems to always crop up when we're faced with intolerance. And that's the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's one of the first things that Christians will reference when trying to attack queer people. And everybody seems to think they know what Sodom means and what the point of the story is. But what I want to share with you today is that there is always more to the story. And we're going to take a little bit closer look at it. If you're not familiar, I'm happy for you. But the story, as it's usually told, is that there was Abraham's nephew Lot and his family living in the city of Sodom, and God was angry with the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and angels went to visit Lot there, and the men of Sodom tried to have sex with them, and God was angry and destroyed Sodom. And so obviously this is a story about God hating homosexuality. Except that that's not what it says. It's not what it says at all. So let's take just a moment and look at it a little bit closer. It's found in Genesis chapter 19. This is some old writing, and there's a lot going on there. And I'm going to draw out just a few portions of this so that we can pay attention to what the story is actually saying. But in Genesis 19, two strangers arrive at the city gates of Sodom. Let me read the first 3 verses of this here for you. 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you can rise early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the square." But he urged them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. So we have this moment where the scene is set with Lot choosing hospitality. And that is an important setting because this is a story about hospitality. This is a story about the way that strangers and outsiders are treated. This is a story about how we act towards other people. But here's the part of it where people tend to trip up and attempt to condense the story a little bit. I'm going to read verses 4 to 10, kind of the action portion of this. But before I can speak. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." By the way, that should be our first hint that this is a story that we shouldn't take as historical. Can you imagine being in a city and literally all of the men? This is a literary clue for us. But let me go on. Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please." Whoa, that got a little rough. There's a lot going on here. saying, "Do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. Man, people are quick to take this passage and use it to hammer at queer people. But, I mean, should we talk about Lot just offering his daughters up instead? That's a serious problem, but it is reflective of the way that women were treated in that time as objects and property, and it's not okay. But here we have this story where, particularly in this cultural setting, when this was written, hospitality is a big deal. In a time before police forces and hotels and restaurants and truck stops, I don't know, truck stops are okay. It's important that people have a place of safety. It's one of the central tenets of Judaism as we understand it in the Hebrew Bible, that outsiders are to be treated with care, that strangers are to be welcomed. And that's not just you should love people. It's a very important and practical concern about the way that people are treated. Because if you are traveling and if you are without your own land and family and power and all of those structural things, you have to depend on other people in order to survive. You have to depend on people in order to be safe. And they're trying to build a society where people are safe. And so we find this story that is meant to speak very, very strongly against this type of inhospitality. It's a story where the people of Sodom wanted to come and know these guys, not because they're gay, because it's an act of dominance. I don't want to get too much in the detail in the weeds here, but particularly in the Hebrew scriptures, what we see condemned is being outside of this pecking order of who has power over who. And in ancient warfare and in ancient societies, that sexual assault was an act of domination and violence. It was to demean people, and particularly between men, they don't have really the concept of sexual orientation the way that we do at that time, but presumably straight men, this is an act of saying, you're like women or less to us. So that sexism in the story is also no mistake. They're trying to treat Lot's guests. Lot was a stranger in the city himself, and they're trying to treat his guests as if they are also just property to be had and used and controlled, the way that Lot is willing for his daughters to be used and controlled. The problem here is not gay sex. The problem is domination and control and assault and violence. That's what's happening in the story, and those are the abominations of Sodom. That's why in the story God rains down destruction on these cities, not because they liked to party in the wrong way, but because they were violently oppressive to people who are outsiders in their society. There's actually a parallel story to this. You might not know that. There's another story in the Hebrew Bible that almost mirrors this perfectly. It's found in the book of Judges. In the book of Judges, I think it's chapter 19. You can take time and read it, but I'll give you the highlight. It's almost exactly the same. The difference is that there is a Levite traveling to the town of Gibeah in the tribe of Benjamin's area. The book of Judges, we're talking about a period of Israel and Judah's history that was before kings David and Solomon and all of them. And they're still living as very much a tribal society. And in this story, this Levite is traveling. He goes to the town of Gibeah, and the men of the town of Gibeah come and say, hey, they say to his host, hey, send that guy out so that we can know him. And the Levite sends out his concubine, his sex slave. And they assault her to death. He sends a message out to the rest of the tribes of Israel, and in that story, judgment against Gibeah is not rained down by God with fire from heaven, but it's the rest of the tribes of Israel coming together and attacking Gibeah and the tribe of Benjamin for protecting them. And justice is handled that way in that story. There's a case to be made. A lot of people think that the story about Gibeah, that the Gibeahites, was the real story before Sodom and Gomorrah, and Sodom and Gomorrah was a retelling of that, where God is framed as the one who's doing the judging, and it's the strangers are framed as angels instead of a Levite. So it kind of ups the stakes to say, hey, this is even more important. That kind of violence. And by the way, nobody points to that passage in Judges where he successfully sends out a woman in his place, and they don't look at that and say, oh man, heterosexuality is bad. Look what they did. You know? But it's the same story. And the story of Sodom heightens it. So how do we get here with Sodom becoming a word that we have in the English language that is, how do we get to sodomy? It goes back to a person named Philo of Alexandria. Philo was a Jewish scholar in the 1st century, very important and influential writings. Philo viewed scriptures as an allegory, and he did a lot of interpretation and reading into it. His writings were so deeply influential. We can see traces of Philo's influence throughout the Christian scriptures and throughout the early church writings. And Philo is the one who looked at the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and said, oh, that's about gay sex. Philo is the reason that we have the word sodomy today in our language. Philo was the one who first equated that story with homosexuality. And again, not that they had an understanding of sexual orientation the way that we do today. But Philo made the connection, and it's stuck ever since. And so that's why we read Ezekiel. Because when we look at the interpretation in the Hebrew Bible itself, there is no ambiguity about what the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah really is. And in Ezekiel it says, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did abominable things before me. Therefore I removed them when I saw it. That's as clear as day. Nobody in Scripture is attacking Sodom for sex. They're attacking Sodom for their violent and deadly inhospitality. And I think that that's important. I have to admit a lot of my thinking on this as I was reading Reverend Elder Dr. Nancy Wilson's book, Outing the Bible. She points out that a lot of queer scholars have looked at that and looked at the word sodomy and said, we have the wrong definition of the word today. Sodomy should be defined as deadly inhospitality. That's how it should be defined. That's what the name of that city should be associated with. And we've seen that type of sodomy play out far too much. We've seen deadly inhospitality. We've seen hatred. We've seen violence. We're talking about it and remembering it this week for Pulse, but we can also talk about Club Q. We can also talk about the upstairs lounge fire, which impacted MCC directly. We could talk about Matthew Shepard, or about the 65 countries where being gay is illegal, or the dozen of those where it carries a death penalty. That's today. That is violent and deadly inhospitality. That is what is condemned in the story of Sodom. It's the real sin of Sodom. Heck, we also see that kind of inhospitality in the way that the federal government has decided that they want to create registries of trans people and criminalize gender-affirming care for young people. That's that same sin. That's that same hatred and intolerance at play. And so, when we take a look at the story of Sodom, it's a cautionary tale, not against being queer, but it's to warn us against refusing a stranger. It's to warn us against cruelty to the outsider. And when we look at that, our visibility matters. It's why we celebrate Pride Month, right? Because visibility creates safety. We fought for these colors. People have died for these colors. We need the visibility. We need safety. Because people are still weaponizing against anybody they think is different. Friends, here at MCC Tampa, we have wonderful diversity. We have diversity of gender and sexual orientation, queer and straight, cis and trans and non-binary. We have a diversity of faith, doubting or devout, spiritual or secular, religious or not. It's all welcome here. We have different people across culture and language and race, and all belong here. That's what we've inherited here at MCC Tampa, our 55 years of history. And it's also the future that we're building together, a place of welcome. When we look at the city of Sodom and the way that they chose to be violent and rejecting the outsiders, we choose to be a different city. We choose to be a different place. And that's the challenge of love. That's the challenge of the gospel. And that's the point of Pride, is that we're able to be together. We're able to be visible. We're able to say, yes, there's a place here. Yes, you know what? You can have a flag. There's a flag for you. There's a color for you. Everybody should be represented. It's why I love our traditional Pride flag, but I love our Progress Pride flag and the Philadelphia Pride flag and the Intersex Progress Pride flag that we have going on today. These are all good because there is a place for everyone. Everyone belongs. We are bound together here in this place, not by creed, but by practice, by our commitment to welcome, our commitment to inclusion, our commitment to loving each other. And that's the real lesson here. Welcome the stranger. Let's build that different kind of community where no one is outside, no one is unwelcome, and everyone is safe. That's the work of Pride Month. Visibility, recognition, and belonging. In the face of violence, of intolerance, of hatred, we are called to welcome, to include, and to love. Happy Pride.